Live from the Orion Cygnus arm of the Milky Way galaxy, this is Scientifically Speaking, a weekly half-hour program devoted to elegant curiosities, and I am one of your hosts, Sarah Chang, and joining me as always is Bernie Ryan, DJ Star Watcher. How are you, Bernie?
Yes, hi Sarah, very good.
Bernie is our professor of the astronomy lab at USM and our local protector of the night skies. Reach out to us at WMPG Scientifically Speaking at gmail.com or on Twitter at WMPG SciSpeak. If you want to find the last 5 weeks of archives of all of our show and all of your other favorite shows, you can head over to WMPG.org. And we also upload our shows onto YouTube. So if that's an easier way, we post them through our Twitter as well. So you can check them out at a later time at your convenience. Bernie, could you let our listeners know what's up in the night sky for this coming week?
Yes, certainly, but glad to do that. All right, so this is Friday, January 29th. So just one day after full moon. That was the full moon in January, sometimes known as the cold moon or the wolf moon, or the moon after Yule, if it's after Christmas, obviously. So basically the moon will be coming up right after sunset because a full moon always comes up at sunset. You can look for that. Unfortunately, by now we would have lost Jupiter and Saturn, so you can't find them anymore. Last week was about your last chance to see them. So in the evening, all you're going to see is Mars, and all you can see in the morning is the planet Venus. So actually, last year about this time it was a full supermoon in February. Now, I was pretty lucky. I was down in Houston at the Johnson Space Center, flying back from Houston when it was still safe to do this a year ago. And I was watching the full supermoon come up in the east. Of course, it always rises in the east. And they had the Saturn V rocket that first went to the first trip to the moon in 1969. They had that model there sitting right in front. So I remember getting this great picture of the full supermoon coming up with the Saturn V rocket that went there over 50 years ago down in Houston at the Space Center. So you have your regular full moon coming up in January and just two planets. So that's pretty much it for this week.
Great. Thanks, Bernie.
Yeah.
And if you couldn't take notes fast enough, you can also check out the monthly What's Up column in the Portland Press Herald. So today's show is on regenerative agriculture. And we have a special guest. Bernie, could you do a quick introduction?
Yes, certainly. Well, his name is Jedidiah Beadle. I first met him many years ago when we were both working on an organic farm in Arundel, Maine, not too far. And basically it was called the Never Done Farm. So we had woofers from all over the world actually there with us at different times. So that's how I first met Jed. And then he moved back to Portland, Maine for a little while, and he's been all over the world and done all kinds of interesting things. And now he's living back in South Dakota where he's from. So welcome, Jed Beadle.
Thank you.
Yeah. So like I mentioned, today's show is on regenerative agriculture, but to kind of help our listeners understand both your background, your experience, your history with this, how long have you been working in farming? Is that your primary occupation?
Yeah, I do construction and I do welding and different types of work that will help me when I buy my farm. Bought a farm in Maine last summer, but it didn't happen with all of the dynamics of today's world. And I grew up on a natural healing center in the Black Hills of South Dakota that is a Seventh-day Adventist healing center, and National Geographic considers this group the longest living group in the United States, and they are real into healthy lifestyle and organic farming and diet. And so I grew up there, left the community and came back and have been farming since I was 20. So for most of my adult life, I've been either on a farm, traveling to farms, doing something that will help with the farm, all regenerative, organic type of farming.
From that time with the Seventh Adventist group, you've always done some form of natural or regenerative farming.
Yes, yeah, there's a real problem here in this area with diabetes. There's an epidemic of the Native Americans live to about 40 years of age on the reservations, and I've done work a lot with them with teaching cooking classes and teaching garden classes, doing community gardens, and worked on farms with the healing center and just kind of different things around here, and then traveling and experiencing different types of farming in different parts of the world. And yeah.
That's awesome. So have you ever actually worked on a conventional farm before this? Just curious to have something to compare to, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I've like hitchhiked through Vermont and ended up on like a high school with a farm that was very conventional, and I worked with some animals, and yeah, it was not really my forte. I'm very into the organic
Yeah.
vegetable side of things. So yeah, I mean, I try to experience a little bit of everything just to understand more of the world and how people are doing things. And there is a book, Solomon. This man lost his teeth eating organic food, and he went to an island and ate conventional food, and his teeth came back. And he found that not all organic food has all the nutrients. So you can, you know, just because it's organic doesn't mean it's healthier necessarily. So it's very dynamic.
Yeah. So you've thrown words like organic and then regenerative agriculture out. They're not synonymous at all, are they?
Yeah, I mean, I don't really care too much for the labels. I don't really think so. I think that there's new language that comes and goes, and buzzwords. But yeah, regenerative, organic, fairly synonymous. But I was hanging out with Elliot Coleman at the Common Ground Fair, the most recent one, and he was really upset because he's an organic farmer from Maine, and he heard this regenerative word, and he's like, organic. He really identifies with organic, and so there's a lot of, I don't know, identity around certain farmers. But I think regenerative is kind of about soil remediation and just kind of building a healthier planet while you're growing healthy food.
Well, when I did some research on it, I found like 5 basic principles, and they're kind of wondering why they're not more widespread, because they're really so much more efficient once you get into them. So the first one is cutting back on chemicals. I mean, no chemicals at all, but certainly cutting way back, doing as much like integrated pest management and that type of thing that you can do. So the yield might not be as high, but you can make more profit for what you're doing because it's better quality if you cut back on chemicals. So then there's one called armoring the soil. So basically, doing the cover crop so you don't just leave the soil bare. You do as little tilling as possible. A lot of these principles overlap with permaculture principles also that we were using at our farm. Then the third one would be promoting diversity. So not all these big monocultures of corn that you probably have a lot of them in South Dakota too. So you promote diversity, and then leaving living roots in the soil. So you feed the soil that way and increase the nutrient value of the soil itself. And then you add in animals and other features, so everything is multi-use. Chickens and pigs and sheep, and everything can have many different uses, very similar to permaculture. So those are the 5 basic principles to regenerate a place, add value to it, make it better than when you left it, when you start with it, and so on. And that should really be working on a much larger scale, because the current methods are really not even sustainable, but this is. So that's what I learned.
Yeah.
When you talk about those roots, Bernie, I feel like I've seen some folks who are really, they identify with the regenerative agriculture label. They'll pick up the plants and they'll show the root system. And one of the ones that I had seen, they were like, look at all the soil that is stuck to the roots. And I feel like that sounded like that was their way of identifying with, or their way of identifying if the soil was healthy or not. I don't know if that's something that you came across as well.
Yeah, that's exactly what I saw when he was doing this video showing some of the techniques and so on. Yeah, because otherwise, yes, if you went to a normal farm, which might be right next to his, there would be nothing on it. It would come right out, and it wouldn't go through the seasons, and it just wouldn't be as healthy, and the nutrients, it was, all those other things wouldn't be working as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Bernie, you had gone through some of the key components of regenerative agriculture. And one of the things that I came across too very heavily in some of the folks that are, I don't know who is, who's who in the regenerative agriculture world, but I know some people. And for example, there's Charles Massey, who's over in Australia. I don't know if you know that name, but he's a fifth generation farmer. And I feel like one of the faces of regenerative agriculture in Australia. He's got a book and everything. And there's a couple more people, but he talked a lot about how in Australia there were these dust storms blowing up kind of the dry top soil. And the storms are due to really, really high winds. And the soil there is kind of this reddish soil. And what he also found was because he later decided to pursue a PhD in this field, and he was showing that you could find kind of red mountaintops in New Zealand because the winds were picking up all that topsoil and blowing it all the way to New Zealand. And they're in New South Wales in Australia, so kind of that southern part of it. He talks about how this regenerative agriculture, all you really need is at least some ground cover to keep that soil down and help that can help mitigate some of the dust that essentially blows up when wind comes through.
Yeah.
And
the loss of topsoil, so that's a good way to keep that covered. Yeah.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And speaking of kind of that, the dust storms, I that's kind of part of this. I don't know if it's not necessarily attributed to what we consider conventional farming using chemicals and industrial products, but it plays into something like desertification. And there's actually a lot of projects, like in India, there's this drought mitigation project in Andhra Pradesh, which is the southern part of India. These areas have a really high vulnerability to drought. And because of many years of kind of killing that soil and sucking the diversity of that soil out, the soil is basically really not great for growing crops, and they also just have really depleted groundwater resources. And so this project has this whole strategy to help improve farmer capacity to adapt to drought, primarily through kind of efficient crop water management and some income diversification as well. But one of the things that they do is they've taken ideas from ecological farming methods, and for example, you have your fields of farms, fields of crop, if you will, and they build these kind of mounds between them and then a basin so that rainwater can be captured there. And then they grow trees along the mound part. And so this was all, the whole idea was that you bring in diversity. And one of the things that's, I think, is part of regenerative agriculture too is using natural means of pesticides. So when we think of pesticides, I think we think of chemicals, but we can also think of pesticides in terms of predators, right? So, for example, I think there's this woman in Missouri who I was reading about, and on her farm she plants buckwheat next to her crops, and when it flowers, it brings in these parasitic wasps, which will eat up the aphids, which are a common pest for her crops.
Yep.
Jed, what other kind of similar components of regenerative agriculture have you used or seen in your experience in farming? Or it doesn't have to be regenerative practices, but anything. I know, like, they're all labels, but ultimately any of those kinds of I don't know if you would say that they're unconventional. I don't know how big the movement is, but that aren't conventional practices, if you will.
Yeah, well, I think there are a lot of things that people are doing that kind of help with weeds by growing intensive, spacing. So you might have arugula you might grow, and it canopies, so then you don't have any weeds, any weed pressure because you've weeded before you put in the arugula, and all of a sudden you have a canopy of arugula, and you can plant grasses and things in the walk paths that you can mow down that are easily maintained. And um, yeah, there's the old practices here of like the three sisters of like the pole
Hmm.
beans, corn, and squash, and those all kind of work together to shade. The corn shades um, the squash, and um, yeah, the beans are able to grow up the corn, and yeah, there's lots of different things.
Yeah, I think that's a really common one. The first time I'd heard of that actually um, was at this talk over in Bethel, and I was like, "What are these three sisters?" And I thought that was was a very unique kind of closed system, I guess, if you will.
Yeah.
Have either of you, I'm just curious, ever heard of someone named, he's this Japanese farmer. He died back in 2008, but have you ever heard of somebody named Fukuoko Masuda?
No.
So this
Did
guy,
he write the straw revolution?
yes, yes.
Oh,
Have
you
you
know.
read that book?
Yeah, I've looked at it, and a lot of people really liked it on the farm I worked at in Maine.
Yeah, so I actually read this book many years ago, and I have no background or history in farming, but it was this tiny little book, and it's not so much of a narrative, but it talks a lot about the practices that he used, and he he is I I don't know what's the right word, but I feel like I can probably safely call him the laziest farmer in the world, or was anyways, because the way that he described his practice of farming was it was called this do nothing farming. Other labels were like natural farming, etc. But it's very similar to these concepts of modern regenerative farming. But ultimately, this was a going back to traditional practices. But one of the things that was really interesting about what he does is, for example, if he wants to grow rice, what he'll actually do is he'll just toss rice into onto the field and then cover it with straw. No rows or anything like that. Just throws it. Doesn't even cover it with like in the patties, which you normally that's how you normally see rice grown. So, anyways, he covers all the rice with straw, and then when the rice has grown to a certain height, then he'll also plant wheat amongst the rice. And so then when the rice is ready to be harvested, the wheat is kind of growing at a pretty, it's at a good height. And Jed, you had mentioned kind of the arugula and, keeping the weeds out. He also talked about that a lot, where doing that leaves no room for weeds, and it reduces the need for weeding, which I think is for kind of your common household gardener, that's like the biggest pain in the butt. But another thing that he also doesn't, I'm curious if either of you had this experience when you were on the farm. I see this sometimes in like with kids. They do this as an activity with kids, but he advocated for the creation of seed balls. So clay, clay molding around seeds, but it's not just one seed or whatever. It's the seed of your crops plus clover, which is a cover, plus herbs, etc. And he'll just put all that into a ball of clay and then just toss it randomly. Is what he described it as, just randomly tossing it. And what's interesting that I didn't realize about those seed balls is that the benefit is that they prevent sparrows or mice for the region that he was in to eat the seeds, and then when it rains, they would sprout. So I'm curious, have you guys did you guys regularly use that at all, or is that something that you've used at all in the past?
Nope, we didn't do that at the farm. You may have done it somewhere else, Jed, but we didn't do it.
There are like what it makes me think about is just that in farming in general, it's different everywhere you go, right? And so what works here, it might not work there, and what worked for him might work here, but it might not. And so I know Johnny's seeds, they sell like these coated seeds that fit perfectly into the cedar. So they fall out perfectly. Like you get the perfect number that you need, you know, because they're coated into these little balls that are like lettuce seeds, and they're, you know, coated, or tomato seeds. And so it makes it very easy to plant and have a very systematical operation, as opposed to like certain cedars that, you know, you drop a seed in and maybe 5 seeds come out, and then it's hard, you know. So,
Yeah.
but that's the thing I can think of.
Yeah. When working with these organic or natural or regenerative growing practices, um, what is the yield compared to, say, a conventional farm? I know, Bernie, you had mentioned that it is less yield, but
Yeah.
I'm curious, like, why is that?
Well, I think it has to do a lot with the chemistry and biology of the soil, and what the plant is taking up, how healthy, how much photosynthesis is happening with the plant. And John Kemp talks a lot about these things. He has courses that I would love to take. And yeah, yeah, I think it has a lot to do with photosynthesis, and the kind of like we have an immune system. So, you know, if we're healthy, we're going to fight off viruses, and we're going to be strong, and just like a plant. If you feed it properly, it'll be able to produce a lot. You can kind of manipulate the plant. And some of this cutting edge information is that you can kind of like manipulate the plant into just a producing stage, because there's different stages of photosynthesis, and there's a stage of, you know, producing fruit, and you can get the plant to get into that fruiting stage and just get it to take off. And I don't think it has to be organic, or, you know, it could be conventional, and figure out how to get it to go into that kind of just fruiting phase and get a high yield.
Yeah, I know. One of the things that always stood out to me with the Japanese guy Fukuoka Masuda, he he would talk about kind of, having this intention of planting a random diversity, but not every seed will come to fruition. Like many of them might just stay as seeds and die as seeds. But ultimately, he just kind of looks around a couple months later, and you know he can see, oh, nature has decided that the radish will live this time, and the other crop that he had also planted did not. So nature decides who thrives, which I think is sometimes it's hard for us. I can imagine that there's some sense of not being able to control all of the variables.
Yeah, no, it's true. And I think we definitely strive to be in control as much as possible, but it's kind of an upward battle to have control over everything, and, you know, get such good yields and healthy plants. But I think science has come a long ways, and people are doing pretty amazing things, producing tons of food on small spaces. And I've seen it in farms I've worked on, and it's pretty amazing. People are using foliar applications and spraying. They take a plant sap analysis, and they send it to Holland, and then they find out what is being taken up in the plant. Even if you do a soil test and find that you have all the nutrients there, the plant might not be taking it up. And so you can give it a foliar application and then feed the plant that way, and that feeds the soil and feeds the roots and
What
biology.
is the foliar application that you're talking about?
Well, it's through this company, and John Kemp's company, and basically you you send a a sample of your leaves. So you take maybe like 5 leaves of your tomato plants, you send it to John, and he takes it and sends it to Holland, and then they test it and see what is actually being taken up by the plant, what nutrients are in the plant, and then he will prescribe you with some kind of foliar application, and it might be a mixture of ground up sea animals. I don't know what it is really. It's a big mixture of different things, and then you kind of give the plant. It's kind of like a supplement, when
Okay.
you need something you're not getting. It's basically a supplement. Yeah, and there's different types, and some farmers are veganic, so they don't want to use any, animal products, so they might ask him for a, plant-based foliar
Vegan
application.
summit. Yeah. Very cool. Well, thank you so much, Jed, for joining us. This is part 1 of our 2-part conversation. You have been listening to Scientifically Speaking here on WMPG with myself, Bernie, and Jed. Stay tuned for Sports Jam with Colin and Connor. And from your favorite nerds, mask up, and we wish you healthy bodies and clean air.